Okay, so we've been talking the last couple of weeks about marriage, or more specifically, or more correctly, about the commandment against divorce in the seventh of the commandments. But we've been looking at marriage, and we've also been looking at the larger issue within that concept, which is the concept of covenant. And so we took a look last week in particular at a couple of different kinds of covenants. The sovereign vassal covenant, where the sovereign and the vassal enter into an agreement in which both of them are going to have duties and obligations, and both of them are going to receive some sort of benefit. There is also royal grant covenants, which is where the sovereign and the vassal enter into a covenant, but it's a covenant in which the sovereign is the one giving everything and the vassal is the one receiving without any particular obligation other than the relationship itself. There is an alternative to the royal grant is the royal edict, which is basically where the sovereign says, here's what you're going to do, and I'm not going to give you anything for it. That's what we call taxes, for example. But now, in many cases, the taxes, in most contexts, in our country at least, get turned around and plugged into doing things. So it's not as though the taxes just go directly into the pocket of our governments. Usually, they're not supposed to. And when they do, people go to jail usually for that. But in ancient times, it was not at all uncommon for a sovereign to enrich himself simply by raising taxes, and it became part of his or her estate. And so that is the royal edict, is probably the best term to use for that. But we're not really getting into that because, interestingly, in the scriptures, there really isn't anything like that. Although we do see some things that come close, where God basically says, this is what you're going to do. He says, I'm holy, so you be holy. Things like that. So we do see some of those kinds of things to a certain extent. But generally, with God, there is something coming from the other side. Whether it's the blessings that he gives to all mankind, or more specific kinds of blessings, or coming out of some sort of a relationship. So you don't normally see God simply imposing a rule without there being some kind of reason and some kind of benefit to following that rule, or to that come with the rule itself. So we looked last week, and the last thing we looked at was Genesis chapter 18, where we have this really unusual situation where there's two things that are unusual about this. One is that it's one of the fairly rare times in scriptures that we actually see God, and we see an internal monologue on God's part. There are a few other cases. The very first one is in Genesis chapter 1, where they say, let us, and so God is speaking to himself. But most often we see God's monologue, or what God is thinking based on what he says, or in the case of Jesus, based on what he says about what God is thinking. But in this particular case, God is meeting with Abraham. He's gone up to him along with the two angels. He has been invited by Abraham to sit down and have a meal and rest. And this is surely in the context of Abraham, at least at the beginning, not knowing who he was interacting with. As the interaction progresses, Abraham presumably becomes aware that at a minimum he is meeting with, or he has encountered something supernatural. And one of the reasons that I use that term, and I'm kind of a little, I'm squirrely on how to say this, is because in the scriptures we see the term the angel of the Lord being used in some cases interchangeably with the Lord. And so in some cases, the angel of the Lord is clearly a distinctive entity, or angels are clearly distinctive entities. The most notable would be, like, for example, when Michael the archangel appears to Daniel, or when Gabriel comes and speaks to Mary, and they name themselves. There's a distinctiveness there. But in other cases, like the most notable one probably that I can think of is Gideon. When Gideon encounters the angel of the Lord, it keeps shifting back and forth between saying the angel of the Lord and the Lord is doing these things and interacting with him. And so when we use the word the angel of the Lord, in some cases that may mean either that God is acting so directly through an angel that they're indistinguishable, or it may be speaking to this idea of the representation of God, a physical manifestation of God that is by no means all of who God is, but is God himself interacting. And that would seem to make the most sense here in the Genesis context. There are other places where that would also seem to make a lot of sense, that when it's talking about the Lord, physically doing something. When, for example, the Lord appears to Moses as a burning bush, God is not a burning bush. You know, or he chose to appear that way, but by no means was all of God and all that he is and all that he, you know, can do contained within that fire. That was a representation. And even the most awesome visitations that he's made, like on Sinai, are still only just a tiny bit of who and what he is, as scary and as huge as that might be. So the simple fact is that God is, every time that God interacts with humans in a way that there's something physical that we experience, we are experiencing a projection, a manifestation, not God in its entirety. So in this situation, whatever it is, however you want to look at this, God is talking to Abraham, and at some point along the line, Abraham begins to realize that this is not just three guys who come up to him. And so before they get ready to leave, in fact, actually they've gotten up and they're beginning to go, the Lord says to himself, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? Because Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed." And so what he's actually saying to himself is, based on my relationship with Abraham, based on what I've chosen for him, he says, "I've chosen him so that he may command his children, bless you, and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so the Lord may bring bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." So what God says to himself is, I feel an obligation to tell this guy what I'm about to do, why it's going to happen. And I feel that because, number one, I've entered into a partnership with him, to a special relationship with him, and he needs to understand what's going to happen, number one, so he's not surprised by it. And number two, because he needs to understand that this is what's going to happen is a manifestation of my righteousness and justice, and not a manifestation of pique or of just, you know, me throwing a tantrum, or of me losing control of the world and having crazy things happen out of my control. Now, I'm inferring and reading some stuff into this, but that seems to be the two basic things that he's saying. And part of the reason I think he says so that he can command his children and his household after him, that's part of that educational process. Abraham needs to be able to explain to his kids why there is a smoking plain of glass and ash south of the Dead Sea, because they're going to have questions about that, you know? And so he's going to need to be able to explain this, and he's also going to be able to tell his children, hey, you know what, when God is serious about something, he is actually really serious about it. You know, this is not some trivial thing. And so he needs to understand this. And so God decides then to tell Abraham what he's doing and why he's doing it. And so the angels, go on down into Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom specifically. God remains and speaks with Abraham. And I told you last week, I always do that. I told you last week that there's an interesting, a conflict is too strong a word, there's an interesting way in which some of the older manuscripts translate the passage that says, in most modern translations, says, then Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Some of the translations read, the Lord remained standing before Abraham. And the particularly unique thing about that is that it implies a very different relationship. Normally when somebody's standing in front of somebody else, they're the ones who feel like they have an obligation, they have a duty, the other person is kind of in charge of the situation. And while I don't think that's true in this case, it does speak to the idea that God had this need that he perceived to stay, an obligation that he perceived that wasn't inherently part of the promise. He never told Abraham he was going to tell him everything that he was doing or anything like that. And yet God feels an obligation because of his relationship. And I think this is a really important thing to understand, because when we talk about covenants, covenants sometimes include things that are not directly addressed in the covenant itself. In other words, you don't have to put everything into a covenant to keep the basic standards of how humans behave towards each other in place. You know, if I enter into a covenant with you to sell you my car for a certain amount of money, it is presumed, without having to write it into the contract, that after I get your money and you get my car, I'm not going to hit you over the back of the head and take my car again. We don't have to write that down. If we did, we would be, our society would be in even worse shape than it really is, if that was something we actually felt like we had to write into our contracts. But more broadly within certain kinds of contracts, if I'm going to sell you something and I know that it's defective, And particularly if I know it's defective in a way that will undermine its purpose or that might make it dangerous to you. There is an implied duty that I have to tell you what that is, that's the situation. Now, we have a buyer beware principle and some of those kinds of things, but that has long since been reversed across most things in our society, where if you know you're selling somebody something that doesn't work, you may be able to get away with it because they may not know your address or how to contact you, but you have engaged in fraud. You've broken the contract, or the covenant, even if nobody can ever really follow up on that. And so a covenant implies some things that sometimes aren't written out in the covenant, but that are kind of behind it that make it so that the covenant will work the way it's supposed to. Because in a contract, we talked about this a little bit last week, everybody's supposed to get something. You're doing something, giving something up, and you're getting something. The benefit of the bargain is the term we use. If one side of the contract does something that undermines or takes away the benefit of the bargain for the other side, then what you have is a fraudulent conveyance or a fraudulent contract, or however you want to say it, but that one side has broken the covenant. So people who enter into, for example, debt with the mindset of, I'll just declare bankruptcy, this is a huge amount of debt, but down the road I'm just going to declare bankruptcy, or I'm just going to use the courts to get out or something like that. People who are proud about being able to have consistently or over time on a number of occasions themselves or through corporations they run or whatever, discharge debt in bankruptcy. They ignore the fact that what that does is it takes away the benefit of the bargain from the other side, and it ultimately is a form of fraud, even if it's a legal form of fraud in our society. It's a form of fraud that is not something to be proud of. And yet some people are proud of it because they got away with it. That's the thinking that they have. I got away with it. Well, okay. But unfortunately, in our society as well, in many cases, it is surprisingly easy to do that more than one occasion and keep going back and getting more, especially if you've got a big enough company or if you yourself are persuasive enough or whatever the reason is. So in our context, though, it's important to realize that the consequences of trying to do that with God are much more severe. God isn't going to be cheated out of his agreements or his covenants, and by the same token, God never cheats anybody in his covenants. He always does what he promises. He always carries out his part of the bargain or the agreement to make sure that it is done justly and fairly. Okay, so let's go back to this again. We've talked about sovereign vassal covenants. We've talked about royal grants. Now the final royal edict, which is kind of the flip side of that one, there's one other kind of covenant, and this is one that does not apply to God. And that is a covenant of parity, which is a covenant between equals that creates benefits and obligations for both parties. Now, why is God never part of a covenant of parity?
There's no one equal.
He has no equals. So definitionally, God can never be part of a covenant of parity, because you can never be part of a covenant of parity when your power is infinite and everyone else's is finite. Because infinite means that there is no end to it. And anything that's finite has a limit. And so it doesn't matter how much power you might have, you are still infinitely inferior to God in terms of your power and knowledge and all of that. And so a covenant of parity will never exist between God and anyone. Not man, not angel, not anyone. But as humans, we engage in covenants of parity all the time. In fact, a lot of the ones we've been talking about are covenants of parity. In general, agreements between people, and even between people and corporations, and even between people and the government, if they are a separate, independent contract, are considered to be covenants of parity. Now, that's different from, for example, the tax laws. Tax laws are not covenants of parity. Those are a royal edict, if you really want to put it into the terms of this thing. You don't get to choose whether you enter into the rules of the tax laws of the country. Except, I guess, other than if you choose not to make any money or sell anything, or own anything, or do much of anything. Then maybe you could avoid the tax laws. But otherwise, you're bound by them, regardless of whether you agreed to them. On the other hand, though, if the government's looking for someone to pave a road, for example, and you submit a bid for that, and the government chooses your bid and enters into a contract with you, that's considered a covenant of parity, even though the government has way more power than you. Why would it be considered a covenant of parity?
Yeah, you both have a stated obligation to conform to the contract.
Okay, that's the second part. But how can it be a covenant between equals?
We elect the government?
Okay, so there's part of that, although if you think about how our government works today, I'm not so sure that that really counts, but there's something more than that though. What is it about our system of laws that makes it possible for a citizen to be the equal of the government when it comes to a contract?
You can sue.
Okay, we have a court system that enables us to use the rules of law to make sure that we are entering in, when we enter into agreements, we are equally positioned. Now that doesn't mean the government doesn't have more money to pay for a defense if we sue them. It doesn't mean the government doesn't, have power to make your life kind of miserable or something like that. But strictly speaking, the courts and the civil procedures of this country exist to create a situation of parity. So that even though the government has all this additional power and money and everything else, the courts can still hold them accountable. Which is why the few times in our history that we've had presidents or congresses or whatever who have chosen to ignore court rulings, it has been so dangerous. Because that undermines the concept of parity. It means some people are actually more than other people are. It's actually one of the situations, and this is not intended as well, it's not exactly a criticism, it's simply an observation. One of the interesting things for people who go and choose to gamble at Native American Indian casinos, that's what they call it. You go to a Native American casino and you gamble there, and for some reason they decide that something happened that, the most prominent example of this was an individual who went to a Native American casino, I don't even remember where it was, and put money into one of those jackpot slots that basically accumulates more and more value, and eventually somebody puts in a little bit of money and it pays out the whole huge thing, and it was $800,000 or $500,000, a big amount of money that this person won when they won that thing. Well, the people who ran the casino went and looked at it, and they determined that the machine had actually triggered a payout falsely. It shouldn't have done it. It was an error in the programming, and so they said, we're not going to pay you. Sorry, we're not going to pay you. It was a mistake. And the response, on the part of the person, as you might expect, is, well, it was your mistake. That's your problem. You got to pay me. The problem is, though, that there is no enforcement action, because when you go onto a Native American reservation, whose country are you in? Theirs. Now theirs is within ours, but theirs has sovereignty with regard to what happens there, as long as it doesn't impute the criminal laws of the state or country, or actually the nation in which the Native American reservation exists. And so unlike our nation, which if you were to go into a casino that was run under American laws in America, they would probably have a very hard time not paying out under those circumstances. The Native American tribe basically could say, no, we're not going to pay out, and you can't sue us because we are a sovereign nation. And the courts of the state, the country, the state of Arizona, or whatever state it was in, and the country, the United States, do not have jurisdiction over us in those kinds of civil matters. The only jurisdiction the federal courts have over the Native Americans are ones that is either written into law or that involves criminal kinds of actions. So, too bad. You can't sue us, you can't have your money. And there's nothing you can do about that. And that's a reality in general when you contract with Native American tribes, is that they can breach their contracts without the law really effectively touching them, which means that they operate much more under the sovereign vassal, royal grant, royal edict kinds of standards when it comes to people who are non-tribal members. Now within the tribe, if you're a tribal member, there are procedures set up and they do follow those procedures, and if they don't, then that tribal member could sue the federal court. So it's complicated and confusing because of a number of different factors, but the reality is that normally in this country, when you're interacting with someone else in this country, you are operating under a covenant of parity if you enter into some kind of an agreement. But the more common kinds of covenants of parity that we encounter are the contracts that we make for each other and with each other. Whether it's something as simple as Jerry selling, different tools from his garage, where you put an ad out there saying, either here's how much I want or best offer kind of a thing. Someone comes back, if you say this is how much I want, and somebody comes back and says, I've got that, I'm bringing it over, you've basically at that point entered into an agreement. And as long as they give you that money, you got to give them that thing. That's a covenant, that's a contract of parity. You got what they want, they've got what you want, everybody gets what they want. Everybody makes that exchange. So covenants of parity are the most common one. So when we talk about marriages in the Old Testament, the question is, what kind of covenant are we talking about? So let's look at Malachi for a second here. Malachi chapter 13. Sorry, chapter 2, starting in verse 13. Malachi does not have 13 chapters. This is another thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Okay, so marriage is a covenant. We've talked about that already. Now, we've also looked at this passage before where he says you dealt treacherously with your wife. Now, would you, looking at the, if we look at the, we look at marriage in the Old Testament, is marriage a covenant of parity between the husband and wife?
Mm-mm.
I wouldn't say so. Who is it a covenant of parity between? This is going to take you beyond what we've read and see what you know about the Old Testament.
God and
Okay, so there is an element of that you're making a covenant before God, and when you make a covenant before God, it actually imputes God in the covenant. But there's actually another covenant that's usually made that actually begins the marriage in the first place, before you actually get married. There's a covenant, an agreement.
And in the Jewish law, from old, and I grew up and it still was like that. You got, say, a man wants you, courts you or whatever, he can actually come too close. But then the betrothal, we see that also in the New Testament. You know, Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but they were not actually consummated, that betrothal. But in the Old and in the Jewish law, when the bride and the groom, they say yes, the fathers do the thing, the deal.
Okay.
As soon an animal is exchanged from the bridegroom to the family from the bride, it's a covenant.
Okay, so you got, at the end there, you got to the heart of this thing. When you actually get right down to it, a marriage under the old law, and for the most part, for most of the Old Testament period of time, even going back before the law of Moses, was more of a covenant between the fathers of the two people involved, or maybe in a slightly more modern sense, between the husband and the father of the bride. One of those two people were making an agreement with the father of the bride, of the wife-to-be, and they would exchange items of value. The woman was viewed as one of the items of value, or in some cases, the woman was viewed as a problem that had to be paid for. And so, depending on the nature of the bride, you might actually have a situation where the father of the bride had to pay in order to get the groom to marry her. That was not entirely common, but it did happen. So, the point though is that the woman was viewed as being part of the estate of the marriage, and to some extent, the husband was too, depending on how you viewed it. But once the covenant was created, the male had much more power. The husband had much more power over the ongoing marriage. Only the husband could determine whether a divorce should happen. Only the husband could determine whether could send a wife away, could bring her back, and basically the law protected the husband's interests in a way that it did not protect the wife's interests. In fact, when you look at the old law, the protections, for example, the prohibitions against adultery with penalties for both sides, is actually an improvement over the kinds of rules that most nations would have had at that time, where adultery was an entirely one-sided affair. If the wife committed adultery, she could be put to death. If the husband committed adultery, good for him. He figured out how to find somebody else to sleep with. So it was not at all a covenant of parity the way that we would think of it. And because of the ability of a husband to put away the wife, to divorce her without any consequence and without any separation of property or anything like that, you had a very unequal situation between the two of them. And so, interestingly, in Malachi, the flip side of that is that Malachi is only criticizing the husbands in this situation. because they're the ones who are dealing treacherously. If you have no power, it's pretty hard to deal treacherously with your covenant. And so the wives in this context are not being criticized by Malachi because they're not the problem. The husbands are the problem because they are abusing the marriage covenant and abusing the fact that there is this power disparity. And I think it's really interesting that when when Paul uses the example, you know what, let me get to that in a second here, but just very briefly, the idea that when Paul talks about Christ in the church, that's also not a covenant of parity. That's God dealing with a human institution or a human group of people. And so there is this, even as Paul is writing that, he is still recognizing that there's a disparity in the power between the husband and the wife, just as there is between Christ and the church.
Are you saying there was no covenant between the wife?
No, I'm saying it's not. I'm saying that it's not a parity covenant. It is closer to, when it comes to what starts the marriage, there's parity in the agreement that the fathers make or that the husband and the father of the bride makes. The covenant between the husband and the wife, though, would be much more closely related to the sovereign vassal covenant, where one is stronger and the other is weaker. And I don't mean stronger and weaker in the sense that men are strong and women are weak or something. What I mean is who has the power in the relationship. You know, you can have a situation where a stronger party is not in any physical way stronger or even in any economic way stronger, but because of, well, let's use an example. A mother, to use a stereotypical example, an Italian mother and her Italian son. She may have a tremendous amount of power over him because of guilt, because of manipulation, because of cultural expectations and stuff like that. He could be vastly wealthy, totally independent from her, and yet still she may be able to get him to do things that he doesn't want to do because of that power that she wields out of that relationship. So sovereign vassal doesn't always mean that somebody is physically superior, but in this case, what we definitely see with husbands and wives in the Old Testament in particular, and throughout most of the New Testament as well, is a relationship that is much more akin to the sovereign vassal covenant. And we struggle with that because I'm using the word sovereign. And that's where maybe the word suzerain is a little bit less offensive because nobody knows what it means anyway. But I use sovereign because it's easier to keep track of. But remember, the point of sovereign isn't that they're the king or they're the ruler, it's that they're the stronger party. And the vassal is the weaker party. And in this situation, in the situation of the marriage that we find in the Old Testament, and even through the New Testament, the first century, we definitely see a situation in which the men have greater power than the women do. The males have greater power than the females, the husbands, than the wives. And because of that, it is not a covenant of parity. Now, we struggle with that because today, I would argue that marriage is a covenant of parity. Why? Why is marriage a covenant of parity today?
For equal today, it says, man and woman coming together as one. So how can be one up there and one down here if you're one?
Well, okay, that's a fair point, although remember that when we talk about the Trinity, we have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and yet somehow God the Father seems to be in charge a lot of the time. Even though they are all equal and the same and everything else. And so I don't think that just because there are two becoming one, it doesn't necessarily mean that one of those two doesn't dominate the resulting alliance. But there's some other things.
Culture.
Okay.
So, yeah, I was going to say, is this question based on culture or actually God's law?
That is a really good question. And that's something we're going to explore. So when and that sort of speaks to the fact that I may not have asked the question as well as I should have, because the question I asked was, how is it today? And that raises an interesting question. Do I mean how is it today in the sense of how is it today in proper husband-wife relationships in the church, or how is it today in our society? So let's break it down. How is it today in our society? Is it parity? Pretty much?
Pretty much.
Because of what? Culture and one other thing. Law, okay? Our culture says that men and women are equal, or at least that they have, overlapping and different strengths and weaknesses, but they both bring things to the marriage, and because of that, they have equality. And under the law, men and women do have equality, and there are lots of rules that are set up to make sure that one party doesn't, if there is a divorce, one party doesn't take off with all the assets and leave the other one, in the dust or with the kids or whatever else it is. There's a great deal of parity. And we're not perfect in that regard, and there are certainly a lot of examples of people who have gotten the wrong end of the divorce for various reasons. Husbands and wives, it just depends. But our system is set up to create as much equality as possible when it comes to marriages. Both sides can request a divorce or demand a divorce. Both sides, in most states we have what's called no-fault divorce, which means that you can, who's responsible for the divorce doesn't really matter unless they're engaged in criminal activity that leads to it, and then it's kind of a different situation sometimes. But for the most part, we have created a situation that says that, and then of course we've also extended marriage beyond just husbands and wives to husbands and husbands and wives and wives. And so as a practical matter, we have made marriage into a very, very civil contract in our society. I don't mean civil in the sense everybody's nice to each other. Sometimes marriage is very uncivil, but we've made it into, it's just a contract. It's just like any other contract. Anybody can enter into it, and anybody can get out of it. That's pretty much it. When we talk about our churches, though, the answer is more nuanced. On the one hand, within our churches, people still have the ability to access the law, which does create a greater amount of parity. And both sides do have the ability to initiate a divorce. And I would argue that under the first century, under the way that Jesus expressed it, that even though divorce is still something God hates and something that he doesn't want to see happen, and even though there still should be an expectation that we're not having that happen, that when it is appropriate for it to happen, when there has been sexual immorality, either side should be able to initiate a divorce. Now in Jesus' time, that wouldn't have been true. In Jesus' time, only the man would have been able to initiate the divorce. And Paul would have been speaking under those same basic sets of rules because that was largely the rule even in the Roman Empire among the Romans, although somewhat less so. But today, because the legal system has changed and our culture has changed, in terms of the application of the responsibilities under and the rights under the marriage, there is a much greater amount of parity even when we talk about Christian marriages. But it has not entirely changed in terms of the power dynamic. Because going back to kind of what Sylvia brought out with this idea that we're, two are becoming one flesh, that doesn't mean that there aren't, that one isn't still supposed to be leading. Dominating is definitely a problem, and that's where we get into some issues with people and their behavior. But leading is a very different thing. And when we see what the scriptures teach, what do we see? Who is supposed to be leading in a marriage?
Supposed to be the husband.
Yes. There's a principle of male spiritual leadership that we find in a marriage that is something that we can't just ignore. Now I skipped over one passage. I do want to look at this real quickly before we get too far into this next aspect of it. We talked about that already. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 20, this is a situation where we see the rules being enforced both directions. So in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham journeys from where he's at in Canaan toward the land of the Negev, settled between Kadesh and Shur. Then he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So we'll find out later why Abraham did that, but somebody tell me why. Why did Abraham go around and tell people that Sarah was his sister?
Abraham said, "So it will be well with you. You're a very beautiful woman, and I may be killed because somebody else wants her,
So basically Abraham was afraid that somebody might like his wife too much and kill him to take her. And since he is on his own, now by this time he's developed a good-sized household and basically a personal army, but he's still in no position to stand up against a king, even a city king, if someone were determined to do that. And so Abraham wants to basically avoid conflict without necessarily thinking through exactly what that might mean if he goes around telling people that his wife is actually his sister. Because on the one hand, that keeps him safe, but on the other hand, it creates a situation where someone might say, well, great, I'll marry her then, And by the way, side note here is, how old is Sarah by this time probably?
What was the question?
How old is Sarah by this time probably?
Oh, she's in her 70s.
70s, maybe 80s. I mean, it's kind of amazing that she was a good-looking enough woman in her 80s that Abraham was worried about her being killed to take her. And indeed, he was not wrong, at least in the sense that other men were interested in her. So that's kind of a remarkable thing. But anyway, Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sinned and took Sarah. And of course, Abraham can't exactly argue. I mean, he could argue, well, you can't marry her without, you can just take my sister. But he's not really in a good position to make the most important argument, which is, hey, I'm already married to her. So Abimelech takes her into his household, and actually, it depends on how you look at it. He may have married her, he may have simply taken her to be a concubine. But either way, he gets a dream that night, in a dream sometime shortly after he's taken her, and it says to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is married. Now you notice here, he doesn't say that she's getting in trouble because she's been, taken, and it's not Abraham who's in trouble. And I've always wondered about that one. It kind of seems to me like Abraham has some fault here, and yet somehow Abraham doesn't get any, not here, and he does it again later on with the king of the Philistines. Neither time does Abraham get in trouble for doing this. But the people who misunderstand or who take him at his word do get into trouble. So he says, you're a dead man because because of the woman you've taken. And Abimelech immediately points out, look, I haven't done anything with her. I haven't had relations with her. I was told that he was that she was just his sister, that she was single. I had no ill intentions here, and I've done nothing wrong. And God actually says to it, the only reason you haven't done anything wrong is because I kept you from doing anything wrong, because I knew that you didn't mean to do what you did. And so it gets fixed, and Abimelech ends up giving a bunch of property and a bunch of possessions to Abraham, and so Abraham gets richer because he lied, which is probably not the lesson we should be teaching our children out of this. But it is a relatively true lesson that you can get out of this particular passage. Okay, so the point, though, the reason I bring this up is because of the fact that there's a reciprocal, in God's view, there's a reciprocal relationship here. This is even prior to the law of Moses, and yet God is still saying, you, the man, if you cause adultery to be happening with someone else's wife, you are responsible for that. You are on the hook or to be judged for that. So we see this idea. And then in Matthew chapter 19, we see this same basic idea about the problem with divorce. And so Jesus says, the scriptures say, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Now this is interesting. What question is he answering with that statement? Say it louder.
If divorce is in.
Okay. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And his response when he comes back, he doesn't directly answer the question. This is an interesting point. As in many cases is true, Jesus oftentimes answers a question either with a question or with an answer that is an alternative version. My favorite one is the story of the Good Samaritan when the guy comes to him and says, who's my neighbor? And his response basically is, whose neighbor are you willing to be? Which is kind of an interesting way to restate the question. So here, though, he says, when he's asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And his response is outside of the law. He doesn't answer under the law at all. What he says is there's a principle that exists that men and women were created, male and female, and they were meant to be joined together as one flesh and not to be broken apart again by men. So to the extent that he's answering the question about law, what he's really saying is that the law that you guys have is subservient to the underlying principle that covenant, and once a covenant is created between a man and a woman and they are one flesh, that law shouldn't be separating them. Law shouldn't be used to separate them. Now he doesn't criticize the law of Moses in this. What he's simply saying is this is the principle.
So, and it's astonishing, I have my Bible open to this.
Well done.
In verse 8, I don't know if you're coming up to that one.
I shift over there.
So it says, they ask him another question. Well, wait a minute now. Moses gave us permission. But Jesus said, from the beginning, it has not been this way. Or divorce has never been scriptural. But we have this tendency to go, well, did they get a scriptural divorce? In other words, a permissible one. And so, to me, God hates divorce at every level. And to scripturalize divorce, to me, is a little bit of a stretch. It's like,
Yeah.
is it a scriptural sin? You know,
Well, or another way to put that way, lawful. You know, we use the word lawful sometimes to describe whether you can do something or not. Is it lawful to do this? Well, okay, so step away from the divorce and remarriage aspect of it and think for a second here. Is it lawful to, you know, to cheat someone in some way? Well, maybe it's not illegal, but does that mean it's okay? You know, is it lawful to lie to people about who you are and you know, and things like that? Well, maybe it's not illegal, but it's not okay. And so when we think in those terms, Jesus' answer is designed to bring out that exact dichotomy that Steve has highlighted here, which is it may be lawful because the rules say you can, but that doesn't mean it's okay. And so morality and legality do not always go hand in hand. We know that very well in our modern society, but it's important to understand that what Jesus is really saying here is that even within the law of Moses, there are situations where what you should do and what you're allowed to do don't quite line up. That you can go beyond what you should do and still eke in under the law of Moses. And in fact, the Pharisees were really good at trying to find extra ways to do that, and also trying to take away some of the places where people might do that, because even they recognized that that was a reality. So when he says this to them, they're not, the Pharisees at least, are probably not particularly confused by this answer, because this is a distinction that they've made for all of their lives, pretty much.
Yes, that was because he said, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality, that there is not actually a reason there for the man to divorce his wife because he might have seen somebody he likes better, or, you know,
Right.
kind of a phony reason to be free from her.
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
so the breakage of the covenant is really what we're looking at.
Yeah.
There's been this contract between men and women that God established from the beginning, and when one of the partners or both break the contract, break the covenant, then I think what you're saying is there's a pathway to move on, but God never wanted that.
Yeah.
Never wanted the breakage of the covenant from the very beginning. Never wanted the immorality from the start. And so it's funny how people though are always looking for a way to do something that they want to do.
Right.
It's
And
like
that's-
King
yeah.
Henry VIII, he wanted to
Right.
get divorced, but
So he had to.
So he had to-
Think about it. He completely changed the entire religion of a country so he could get a divorce. That's a pretty far place to go to get a divorce. You know, but you're right. And it's when we think about marriage and the significance of marriage, we should realize that it is probably the second oldest covenant in human history. The oldest covenant is God's covenant with man. It basically says you can eat of any tree of the garden that you want to. It basically saying, I'm giving you all the stuff, and it's pretty much free, and it's going to work really good for you. We know because later on, when man breaks the covenant, things stop working the way they're supposed to. But you think about like the garden that you grow things in, or if you've grown or farmed or whatever, it's hard work. Even if it's going good, it's hard work. It wasn't for Adam. It was not hard work. He didn't have to sweat to do that. He just grew stuff. His job was to take care of the garden. I don't even know what that means exactly, but I guess like keep things trimmed up a little bit or something. I don't know, but everything was working in harmony with him. So the covenant between God was, here's what I'm giving you. I'm giving you a garden that grows everything, that you don't have to do anything. You basically just work in the garden or find things to do to amuse yourself. And in exchange, you don't eat from this tree. This one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the original covenant. The second covenant is when God creates woman, gives her to man, and they become one flesh. That's the second covenant. The first covenant between humans, the second covenant in all of existence is the marriage covenant. That says it's probably pretty important. We remember Cain because he was the first what? Murderer. It's real easy to remember for, we all know what Cain did wrong, when you're the first of anything, it's usually a big deal. And marriage is a big deal because it's the first covenant that humans enter into. So when we talk about this, and I think, Steve, the way you said this, I've never really quite thought about it this way, but I think it makes a really good point, which is that we want to define it in terms of scriptural or unscriptural divorce. And what we're really doing is we're trying to fit it under a law, a legal system. under the system of the law of Moses, or under the system that Jesus had said basically about divorce for adultery, or divorce for immorality. But ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a way to get out of this covenant that we're not supposed to try to get out of, that is supposed to be a hard and fast thing. Now, there are problems with that principle in application. The problems derive from the fact that human beings are not very good. And so next week we're going to talk about some of the problems that derive from that interpretation and look at it a little bit more in a little more detail. But my point is, and we're going to look at is less about the problem of immorality and adultery than it is about some of the other things that happen when somebody is abusive in a marriage, or someone is, marriage is a problematic marriage for some reason or another.